Hi, I'm Jeff Tsai from Forte Swordplay. Wanted to bring a video to everybody here today for a couple of different reasons. One of the audiences that this is intended for is for Forte students. This is material that we go through all the time, and so I think it's here particularly to be a reference for students as a reminder. And I think a lot of this is actually worth sharing with HEMA in general, just as another hopefully useful perspective on fundamentals. And in fact, as far as fundamentals go, over 20 years of looking at a lot of different sources, primarily the German Kunst des Fechtens tradition, we have kind of sort of gleaned that there's actually sort of like a broader set of fundamentals that I think is worth looking at. And so what we wanted to do was, because a lot of these fundamentals I've found are not actually really in common conversation in the hemisphere, I really wanted to just kind of get some of this stuff out there so that there is, some presentation of maybe what are sort of typical HEMA fundamentals and maybe some less common perspectives that are not necessarily things that would conflict with any of what normal HEMA people typically do today, but actually add to it, right? Like, are there things that are sort of additional fundamentals that will add not only to how you would actually perform, when you're actually fencing or fencing in a tournament or sparring at a club, but also in helping us understand the historical record, right? Like when we look at interpretations, when we look at fencing techniques that were written down back in the day, do they actually help us understand that art and interpreting that art, the source from which we are, in theory, trying to figure out how to, turn that into actually application, real life use of this art that, we have no living connection to. So anyway, so we want to get to these fundamentals and understand what's pretty common, and then what are the things that are sort of a little bit unusual, and maybe some things that add to what everybody else is doing. So as a starting point, I want to talk about parts of the sword. So here I've got a sword, and there's all sorts of nuances, but we're going to keep this pretty simple. Blade, hilt, right? So here's the blade. We'll talk about parts of the blade in terms of there's sort of like the tip, or what is called the weak or the foible. The German tradition uses the term Schweck, which is weak, and then here is the strong of the sword. And these are, when we talk about putting the sword against someone else's sword, there's all sorts of leverage considerations. So when you've got this against this part of the opponent's sword, this is going to feel weak leverage-wise. This is going to feel strong leverage-wise. So the German is stark versus weak, Schweck. And then we've got the cross of the sword, the crossbar here. We've got the hilt, and then we've got the pommel. And then obviously important thing is to how to grip the sword. So there's a lot of times when sort of like a Goldilocks principle is important, right? So you want to make sure that you're not doing too much of something and not too little. So you want to be sort of just right in terms of the grip, not too hard in terms of like this real stiff hammer grip. You need some suppleness with the grip. So more of like a hammer, not a hammer grip, but a hand-shaped kind of grip. So a little bit more supple. And also not with the grip too close to the crossbar. So when you are doing things where you actually have to move the sword around, you'll see that this bangs against my wrist if I'm too far up here, so a little bit further away, okay? And you'll also see that when I grip with my backhand, it's sort of further away from the primary hand. So my secondary hand, the further away I can be, the more leverage that I can get, even to the point where I'm potentially sort of like cupping the pommel. So cross grip, pommel at the end. And the rest of this, a lot of this is just kind of practice with the sword as we kind of go through a lot of standard mechanics on how to attack and cut. So speaking of that, I think the next thing that we're going to kind of move on to are, what are the kinds of cuts that we want people to just be able to start with. So we're going to start with the concept of full cuts, right? So There we go, right? Full cuts. Okay, so I'm gonna try to minimize my footwork. Let's just focus on the blade work, okay? So you'll notice like these angles, these diagonal cuts that I'm doing, which the Germans would call Rath cuts or Zornhau, right? You can do them at different angles. They can be a little flatter, a little wider to the point where they're, these would actually be called middle cuts, which we're gonna stay away from for now. So a little bit more vertical. And I'm kind of making this choice based on if I can envision like the shoulders of my opponent, I want to be able to cut sort of from shoulder down to the opposite leg, right? That way I'm tracing a path sort of all the way through my target. So, and also the more vertical you do it, that tends to be faster than if you're going wide, okay? So this helps with speed. But you can't be so vertical that you actually hit the floor, right? So that kind of gives you a sense of like how wide that quarter needs to be, right? So that's what that kind of looks like. So these are full cuts. So just getting used to this kind of motion is really, really helpful. And you'll notice that there's kind of like a little bit of commonality in terms of transition points, right? So all of them have sort of like a transition point starting up here through a longest reach position here and an ending position down here, okay? So the Germans have names for all of these. So there's vom Tag, from the roof or from the day or from above, Langenort, long point, and then down here, Alber or Fool, right? Those are from the earliest parts of the tradition, generally named, right? So vom Tag, Langenort, Alber. Vom Tag, Langenort, Alber. And then from the side, vom Tag, Langenort, Alber. Vom Tag, Langenort, Alber. Okay? So those are kind of really helpful, I think, a lot of people think of them as static positions, but as you'll see the way that we kind of implement them, they can be static, but they can often be used in a much more dynamic kind of way. So as places that you're going to pass through, right? So you'll also notice I use the term full cut. So I'm going to define a full cut, meaning I'm cutting in a single plane, right? So if I'm cutting through a target, anytime you're trying to cut through a target and it twists a little bit, you're going to have trouble getting through the target, okay? So we're going to go fully through the target in one plane, nice and clean. These are full cuts. Now, if I were to just cut the long point and then pull away, each one of these would be half cuts. So that's what we're going to define as a half cut, okay? Right? Right, and then from here on the side. All right, there we go. So half cuts from the right and from the left, right and the left. And since we're here, cutting to long point, other things to really think about long point is if this really is your longest distance is going to be sort of that line from point through the hands to the shoulders. This is your longest point, okay? So that's a good way to make sure that you're not kind of cutting too low, but nice and straight out. Okay, great. So that kind of covers basics in terms of some full cuts, some half cuts, and it's a little bit of an introduction to like future cutting patterns, which are going to be super important. But that's a good starting point, and we'll get more into that in the next video in terms of where do we go with some of these mechanics and connecting the cutting with the stepping.